Hey, welcome back to the Mining Pod. On this week's show, we're joined by Mike Hamilton of Griid to discuss, well, actually, runes. Mike was on the forefront of the runes saga or race or whatever you want to call it over the last 2 weeks. So we sat down with him at Bitcoin Plus Plus in Austin, Texas. We also go through a lot of how miners should think about working in the technical landscape. He is the chief research officer at Griid, so he has a great look into everything from building out ASICs to site procurement to tech stacks for miners, and then also how miners should think about working with Bitcoin developers, whether that be block template construction or pools, or in this case, runes. So thank you to Mike for making this happen. We'd also like to thank CleanSpark, America's Bitcoin miner, and Foreman Mining, Master Your Mining for being the lead sponsors for the show. We'll hear a little bit more from them just a bit later in the episode. Before we jump into it, we want to push everyone to go check out the Blockspace Podcast Network with The Gort Show and Bitcoin Season 2. You can find both those shows on blockspace.media. We have Charlie talking with everyone in Bitcoin Season 2, new faces, new actors, and what's happening with Bitcoin. And The Gort Show is conversations with crypto's brightest lights about Bitcoin and how people should think about Bitcoin. Go check out those two shows at blockspace.media today. Okay, on to the show. Hey listeners, let's talk about revolutionizing your mining operation with Foreman. This isn't your average management tool. It's an all-in-one solution for reducing costs and significantly boosting your revenue. Foreman brings a cutting-edge dashboard to your fingertips, empowering you with automated energy strategies. This means not only curtailing around real-time prices, but also strategically enhancing your profit margins through demand response. It's about leveraging energy efficiency to its fullest potential. With Foreman, you get a system that scales with your business, inventory management for assets, infrastructure integration, and business intelligence. Foreman elevates the cash flow and production of your entire operation. To see how Foreman can redefine your mining operation standards, visit foreman.mn. With Foreman, you're not just managing a mining operation, you're setting a new standard in the industry.
Are you a retail or institutional investor interested in Bitcoin mining companies? The Miner Mag brings you free data and analysis from all major NASDAQ-listed Bitcoin mining operations to know who stands out. Check out visualized metrics and data-dependent stories at theminermag.com.
Welcome to the Mining Pod Bitcoin Season 2 crossover episode. If you're whichever platform you're watching this on, go subscribe to the other one, the Mining Pod Bitcoin Season 2 from Blockspace Media. I'm Charlie Spears here with my co-founder, Will Foxley. But most importantly, we are here with Mike Hamilton.
The first guest on the crossover.
The first crossover guest.
Ever.
Nice.
Besides, do co-hosts count? No, probably not.
Mike, we've known you for a while, but imagine you're speaking to a hybrid of both runes, degens, and dumb Bitcoin miners. Who are you? What's your main gig? And why in the world is a Bitcoin miner dabbling in runes?
Okay, there's a lot of meat on that one. So my day job, my normal job, I work for Griid Infrastructure. We're a large Bitcoin miner, we mine all across the U.S., a bunch of different places. And then I got into mining, I guess, maybe 2016, when our CEO actually is the one that got me hooked on mining back then out of my basement at the old house, and then just shy, I guess, 5 years ago, left to go do full-time mining. So that's how I ended up in mining. And then I guess for the ordinals/rune degeneracy, I don't even remember exactly how I came into it. I suspect it was there's a group chat that Nick was in, and I guess because he started the
I think
Monday
you
group.
and I were in part of this.
Which Nick we're talking about?
Yeah.
If we can't reveal.
Luxor Nick. Luxor Nick. Is there another Nick?
No, but just for like the
for
the audience. Who's,
I forget that
there's imaginary people.
Yes, there are imaginary people on my back porch. So I think when he started that other group, that's how I was like, oh, okay, I don't get it. But I'll hop in and learn more about what ordinals are and what they're doing. I was never, I never was in the ETH space or any of and I never got in the NFTs before, but I have missed many an opportunity in the past, and so I wasn't gonna let this one completely go by. So yeah, I started inscribing pretty early on.
Notably, I think a lot of people don't know this. You did the first Rickroll.
I did the first Rickroll, although I will admit that I didn't actually inscribe the Rickroll because that was another winter storm in Austin, and we didn't have power for 3 days. So my entire infrastructure was down, but I really wanted Rickroll. So actually, Nick was kind enough to actually inscribe it for me. And then when he sent it to me a couple weeks later, he was like, I feel like I'm getting rugged on this one by sending this back to you.
Rickrolled.
So the first one I actually inscribed was probably, I think I inscribed a few under 10,000 maybe. When I actually inscribed it myself with my own node. So I will admit that I did not actually push the button, though I did create the image and send it from my phone. And of course, during the day when there's no power, then the cell phone internet doesn't work, so it was a cluster. But I was definitely going to get that Rickroll done.
For being a Bitcoin miner and then moving over into inscriptions, what was sort of like the thinking behind it? You said you didn't want to miss another opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, it's just anything. I mean, like this other project that I'm that I've been working on sort of on the side is sort of a tribute to the fact that I don't know the technology and the things that there are about Bitcoin that make it special. So many people don't understand. So many people get wrapped around the hard cap and the fiscal policy and the economics of it. I came to Bitcoin 100% from the mining is super fun and cool and I came into it from that side, and then I came much later to the realization on inflation, the fallacy of inflation, and sort of the economic side. I came much later to that, and so just with ordinals and taking advantage of some of the cool things that are sort of under the hood that people don't understand is what got me excited, and that's why this other project, which we can talk about later, why it's so focused on all the cool things that there are and trying to highlight those things.
Yeah, that's the Mutable Trees project. We'll probably talk about that towards the end, but you've really, this past couple of weeks were very defining for you because the Bitcoin halving happened. Rune's protocol, Casey's Fungible Token Protocol, launched. And for the miners listening to this, that's what caused all the fees after the halving.
Yep.
But there was a race and competition to who could acquire the first Runes tickers.
Yep.
And I think this is one of the more interesting stories because you got the second Runes ticker. 0, 1, you got number 2. So technically the third.
Technically the third. It's the second that was actually etched versus hard-coded.
Yeah. And
can you explain those terms? Etched, hard-coded.
Yeah.
First 10 runes as well. Either of you guys. I'm not going to be the one.
Yeah. So I mean, I guess I guess start with the etch. So when you have a rune that you want to, I'm trying to think of a good analogy, but call it a coin for maybe is an easier way to think about it, that you want to release, you have to etch it. The transaction is called an etch. And one of the things that happened with the BRC20 craze was people were land grabbing for tickers, and then because of the ordering in blocks, people would just pay more fees. They would see, okay, this guy's minting, I don't know, XYZ. Well, he only paid 50 sats a byte of VB, so I'm going to go 60, and then I'm going to front run him. So this etching process is actually a 2-step process where you actually use taproot scripts, almost exactly like ordinals, to effectively commit the ticker to, but in a secret way, and then 6 blocks later you can actually reveal what that ticker was. So there's a little bit of coordination you got to do. If you reveal too early, then it becomes invalid and you've thrown everything away. But that's sort of the etching process. Now the hard-coded one, Uncommon Goods, which Casey hard-coded in to be 0, the 0th rune, the thing, 0th?
First.
The first,
the original.
But like that's like as a hardware guy, like everything I always did is in school and in the first part of my career was always 0 based. So it's always confusing to be the first, but it actually has a 0
Yeah.
0 index.
There's a lot of attention. There's a lot of money coming in that wants to acquire these early runes. And you and a partner of yours were able to basically get one of the most desirable like runes tickers and like runes numbers. Can you? I kind of want to go into this process because it's very interesting how you guys did this under the hood.
Yep.
Tell me about first you and Chip, and then talk to me about how do you beat everyone else to rune number 2?
So Chip had found the CyberKongs guys who were interested in in doing an airdrop for their Promethean holders, and they're coming at this from the ETH space, and so they were looking for someone that could help get the rune etched. And I don't know that originally we were necessarily trying to go try to get the first. I think that sort of evolved as we sort of worked through the process. Yeah, so they came along and were looking for someone to help, and we decided we could help. So yeah, that process was interesting because there's a few things. One, first you have to, like I said a second ago, you have to actually commit to your ticker at least 6 blocks before you reveal, and then the reveals didn't start happening until 840,000 the block, the halving.
So you committed to this particular rune's ticker 6 blocks before the halving.
Yeah, now we actually committed probably 55 or 60 blocks earlier, and there's actually some theory there as well in how to best handle it, because part of the problem is was trying to structure the transaction so that because who knew what fees were going to be at 840,000. And so generally the way blocks get constructed, for those that don't know, is they're generally ordered by effectively the fee rate that you're paying. So you have a transaction that's some size. If it's a monkey JPEG, maybe it's larger than some binary text or some binary data. But they basically get inserted in the blocks in the order of the fee rate that you pay. Well, nobody knew what fee rates were going to be. I saw Lee and I was speculating that 5,000 to 10,000 was going to be the fee rate on a per byte basis. But you could also argue that he had a vested interest in getting an early rune. So is he trying to game the market by setting people's expectations that it's 5 to 10? And so there was a little bit of game theory and trying to figure out how you wanted to actually pay, what rate you wanted to pay to secure your place in the block.
Because you don't want to overpay at the end of the game.
You don't want to overpay, but you also don't want to underpay and get left behind.
Yeah.
And so there was some interesting techniques that we implemented. We didn't actually end up using, but in fact, the person, the team that got won was using a similar technique, but they had a bigger stack. They had, I think there was 22 or 23 Bitcoin they had lined up in that UTXO ready to pay. So basically in this commit transaction that we did before, we basically committed the amount of funds that was our maximum budget. And then by reducing the refund and the reveal transaction, we could have basically stepped up the fee to pay with the understanding that a block time can happen in 2 seconds or it can happen in 45 minutes. And it turns out that block was actually relatively quick. I think it was only 3 or 4 minutes from 839,999.
So from a business deal structure, and you have to take the business develop, like the business side of it, and combine it with the technical. So you have to commit the funds in advance, speculating on what the fees of the halving block are going to be. And you built tooling to adjust and tweak those fees as the current fee market ramps up and down very volatilely. And through this process, you managed to beat the other 1,000 or so tickers which try to get into that block.
Yep.
And you got the rune number 2.
Yep.
I kind of want to dial in one more bit deeper and just tell me, what particular tools did you build? Because you had to build some custom scripts to ensure that you didn't get left behind as fees ramped up towards the halving block.
Yeah. So, a couple things. My assumption was that the vast majority of people were going to be using, the standard org client, which it was pretty trivial to modify the code to allow you to commit 6 blocks earlier so that you could reveal at 840,000. But it would take a whole lot more for someone to take that, all the Rust code, and then build the ability to like dial up the fees. So I basically built some tools to do that for me, which basically would commit the call it the commit transaction, that had all the essentially had the budget for the reveal in there, and then it sat there and waited until 833 839 999 hit, and then broadcast the reveal transaction with, and again, by changing, because when you send a Bitcoin transaction, you have inputs and you have outputs, and if you change the value of the outputs, you effectively change the fee, because the fees, whatever inputs minus outputs, become the fee. So you just reduce the outputs, and that increases the fee. Now, ultimately, the team decided to go full bore and not risk. Like I said, I've been watching blocks a whole lot more than I ever have in my life, and even yesterday, there was 3 or 4 blocks where there was 10 seconds between. So there was some risk that if you commit to a fee and you don't, you submit your reveal transaction, and then you replace by fee with the next hire to move yourself up into that block, that the block could close or it could get mined, and then you lost the opportunity. So we ultimately decided to go full budget, all in. But we did have the tooling to have been able to step up from 15 sats a byte all the way up to what we ultimately ended up paying. And so some people would argue that we ended up overpaying, but if the block had, if we had submitted at a lower fee rate and then the block hit quickly, then we're the people that that missed out on an opportunity, that had the budget and didn't do it.
In the competitive world of Bitcoin mining, one name stands out: CleanSpark, America's Bitcoin miner. At CleanSpark, efficiency isn't just a goal, it's our standard. Our sophisticated facilities are built and led by expert teams who care about Bitcoin and the communities we work in. Scale? We've mastered it. Our large-scale operations have set us apart in the industry as examples of community-oriented building. Our track record speaks for itself. We navigate the complexities of the new economy with precision and with skill, continuously achieving operational milestones. Curious about how we do it? We invite you to discover the story behind CleanSpark's success at cleanspark.com.
The average runes and ordinals person knows the name of the ticker because it goes Casey's original uncommon goods, and it goes the Fehu ZZZ ticker, and then it's which is the decentralized ticker. And then there's a few other big ones like Leonidas' dog go to the moon. But arguably, the fees paid for the decentralized ticker is its own marketing budget, which is very interesting, in my opinion, looking at the current, because you released this, it's out in the wild, you've airdropped it, everybody. The overall market cap is well beyond what you originally paid for the ticker.
Yes.
The airdrop process is also quite complex. For the mining audience, if they're still here, what is an airdrop?
This was a whole new one for me as well. I mean, obviously, like I said, not really being not originally coming out of the NFT space, but for lack of a better way to explain it, airdrop is basically when some group has something they want to distribute to a bunch of people, either usually for free, and that involves sending out lots of things to lots of people. In the decentralized case, it was, I think, 57,000 unique unique wallets.
And that means 57,000 transactions.
It means 57,000
outputs.
UTXOs,
Yeah.
not necessarily in in a 1-to-1 ratio. And that was part of the tooling and infrastructure to get that implemented, because that's also, there's not exactly a whole lot of tools off the shelf for taking 21 billion tokens and airdropping it to 57,000 unique wallets.
And you did this.
We ultimately ended up doing it. So yeah, the CyberConks team, they've handled the budgeting, and we did the etch, and then we then ran the actual airdrop, which was far more stressful. It's hard to know, because with the etching, it had never been done, right? There's other people trying to also do it at the first time, and it doesn't take much to screw it up, and then you've left a whole bunch of money and fees on the table and didn't end up getting the ticker. We did end up successfully doing that, but now, seemingly, especially after the the dog drop and the market cap of the dog to the moon, what the value was going to be, it's up to the market, but it was likely not going to be small. And there was definitely some nerves in pushing that very first button of, I could potentially be destroying large amounts of value,
Many
Bitcoin of value, both in the original, the original etch, as well as the theoretical market value of the actual, tokens, the actual runes on the market. So that was complicated, and there's lots of things about the Bitcoin protocol that I think, especially like from a miner's perspective, most miners probably don't. I don't want to overstate or overgeneralize, but I know for me, I didn't necessarily understand all that much about the actual protocol. I mean, I generally knew, okay, inputs, outputs, signatures, all the things, but the reality is we're more focused on operational, efficiencies, and that's more like, scripts and software and management tools to manage, tens, hundreds, of thousands of miners, and all sort of the nuts and bolts of, block construction and, transactions, sort of all under the hood. You're sort of not really exposed to that. So this is super interesting sort of exercise in general, because now there's probably not many more people. There's probably not a handful of people on the planet that now know the transaction structure. Now, I don't pretend to know like the cryptography and understanding like all the, the various signature types and all that stuff. But in terms of how a construction, a transaction gets constructed, and the size, and how, when everyone was trying to split their UTXOs in advance of, so that they could mint, because you can only mint one rune per transaction, and trying to split all their UTXOs so that they had more so they could mint multiple at the same time. Well, the problem with that is anytime you split a UTXO, to send, say, one Bitcoin from one UTXO is less expensive than to send one Bitcoin from 5 UTXOs that add up to one Bitcoin, because you're paying this address overhead. And so there's all these different interesting, nuances in the actual protocol and how it works, that make it, a bit of a challenge. Sorry, I completely lost my place.
No, I kind of wanted to let you run, because I think it's really hard. I struggle myself to communicate to both a mining audience and even like a tenured Bitcoin audience what exactly we do in the world of ordinals and runes, because it gets very technical and very weird and arcane very quickly. Pulling back a bit, you spent now, I would say, a tenured career in Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining as like timelines go, and you're now diving even deeper into the world of Bitcoin. What are your thoughts on is the average Bitcoin miner going to have to get way more technical going forwards about how Bitcoin works under the hood?
That's a good question. I don't know if it's totally necessary. I think it's always good to understand the underlying technology of what what you're working on, especially if you built a career on supporting your family with Bitcoin mining. As much as you can understand about the protocol and how Bitcoin actually works, I think is always a good thing. That said, not everyone is going to be able to go dive in and look at a a big Indian encoded version of a LEB 128 encoded integer. And I don't know that that's necessary to still be able to
I hope not.
enjoy
I'm not going to do
Bitcoin and be able to to participate in it. So I don't necessarily think that that's totally necessary. That said, one of the things that this whole exercise has done for me is make me understand, I think, the reality that other layers on top of Bitcoin are 100% going to be necessary for larger mainstream adoption. Mom and pop and grandpa and kids are not going to be doing UTXO management and wondering, hey, I sent 0.05 Bitcoin and it's costing $2 in fees. Now I'm sending 0.051 and now it's $9 in fees. Why does that matter? And those things, just people aren't going to, there's got to be some abstraction on top of this base layer. So I think that's the one thing that this has done for me. And I think other people, especially in the mining space, should understand that, especially because if you look at miners, especially a lot of small miners, if you're getting this, like what a normal pool minimum payout's, 0.005, something like that. Well, if you're mining, over a long period of time, especially for like a home miner, even if you're actually hitting that threshold every day, well, now you have a bunch of these small 0.005 UTXOs. Okay. So at the end of the day, you've got 1 Bitcoin, but that's in whatever that is,
pennies,
200 chunks. I think that's right. My math's not that good, but 1 Bitcoin and 1 UTXO is not the same, does not have the same purchasing power as 1 Bitcoin.
I want to double click on this. And I think this is what a lot of Bitcoin miners, if this is one thing you take away from this, if you're getting pool payouts of like 0.005, and you've been doing this for the past year, like 1 Bitcoin in 1,000 outputs is not the same as 1 Bitcoin in 1 output.
Absolutely.
Can you explain this again?
Yeah. So this is sort of what I was talking about with a second ago, but effectively for every UTXO, which is, if you don't know, it's an unspent transaction output. It's basically, your balance in your account, if you will. And so in order to spend that UTXO, you have to use the transaction ID of whatever transaction it's an output of. Then you also have to, you need the index, but part of that is you need the address to where you're going to send it to. So there's a whole bunch of overhead that happens. And in this case, it's really the transaction ID when you have lots of UTXOs that you're trying to spend, it's really that transaction ID that becomes the overhead. So if I'm trying to send 1 Bitcoin that's in 1 UTXO, I have 1 destination address, and there's a whole bunch of other stuff. But for all practical purposes, I've got that, and I have the signature. So I have the address and the signature that allow me to prove that I own it and can spend it. Well, if I've got 200.005, it's going to really bug me if it's not 200, that I'm saying the wrong number. I'm pretty sure.
You hand wave.
So now to send that same 1 Bitcoin, I now have 200 times transaction ID, 200 times signature for all 200 of those outputs that I'm trying to sign for. It turns out that's about 43 or so bytes for each of those. Well, maybe at 2 or 3 sats a byte, 43 bytes, on a 43 times, 2, let's call it 86, 120 or so if it's 3 sats a byte. On a 0.005 UTXO is not that, it's a relatively small percent. But for argument's sake, it's 200 sats a byte. Now, all of a sudden, if you've got 500,000 sats and you're paying, 120 times 200, you're paying like, what was that, 60, 70, 80,000 sats on a 500,000 sat UTXO you're trying to spend. You're now paying like 10% as opposed to
to turn this into actionable advice is that if you're a Bitcoin miner and you get excited about fees going up, great. I'm also excited about fees going up. This is the validation thesis of Bitcoin. But at the same time, it means that a lot of the things which you might not have had about Bitcoin on your radar can actually work against you. Specifically, this thing of like managing your outputs. A lot of people think that Bitcoin just exists in a big pile in your wallet, but no, the Bitcoin's split into chunks and it matters how it's split up.
Yep.
And we're headed, maybe we can talk about the future of fees, but if Bitcoin does transition to a fee model, or fees are the primary source of revenue for miners, a lot of us miners are gonna have to get our shit together, because now we're going to be better about managing our own wallets and our own UTXOs, which is not something we've really thought of before, I'd say, as an industry.
Yeah, I think it'll be interesting when you look at a finance guy's job description on a publicly traded miner's website, and UTXO management is in the description, and experience with consolidating and managing UTXOs is sort of listed there, because ultimately that's ultimately where it falls in sort of that finance department, and I think that's going to be an interesting transition. Now, I will say, there's been lots of, I think, discussion how depending on where the miners send it, are miners sending it straight to hardware wallets? Are they sending it to custodians? And so there's some of that gets lost in the noise. If it's going to a custodian,
it's their issue.
It becomes their issue, because when you say I'm going to cash out X, they're cashing you out X, and the UTXO management sort of falls on them. But there's certainly plenty of folks that are not necessarily mining into a large exchange, and there's certainly good reasons for that. So that'll be interesting to see how that plays out, in the coming years, as fees theoretically, increase. It just makes consolidation and managing that just so much more important.
Need ASIC help? Check out Vitamine, one of Bitmain's certified repair shops located in Washington State, with satellite offices in Colorado, Oklahoma, and Texas. PSUs, hashboards, immersion setups, in and out of warranty repair, Vitamine has you covered. Want to train your technicians? Bring Vitamine to your site for hands-on training in the art of ASIC repair, complete with Bitmain AMTC certification. Contact Vitamine today at dan@vmasic.com. Again, that's dan@vmasic.com. When you think of ASIC repair, think Vitamine.
I want to go back earlier to talking about how miners should look at this and some of the other innovations. So Marathon's been the most aggressive. Maybe Luxor's also been pretty aggressive too. But in terms of well-known Bitcoin miners working at Griid, how are you thinking about this? How are you talking to like your employees or other members of the executive team about what's happening with runes and inscriptions? Is this something you guys even like look at yet?
Yeah, that's a good question. We haven't had too much of a discussion around it. I think most of the discussion, because of the impact of halvings on miners and revenue and things like that, I think that is where the discussion has more fallen on what that looks like going forward. Only in so much as runes activated at the halving as a meaningful sort of milestone to activate the protocol. I think for us it's been much more about the impact of the halving on miners.
Do you think that'll change? Do you think it'll be like a more important thing in the next 2 years for say a company like Griid, which doesn't necessarily have to do much besides point your hash rate at a pool of your choice? Do you guys think you're going to get more interested in like hiring those kind of technical people, like you'd be hiring someone to do UTXO management?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're not looking at those sorts of things, then you're going to be behind the ball when, and that's actually maybe, something that'll be interesting if that becomes a point of disclosures. It's like, okay, a lot of people are like, even if there was news about the coal company that's got, a couple hundred Bitcoin on their balance sheet, they've been mining, whatever. But one thing that'll be interesting is that, again, because one Bitcoin is, I don't want to say one Bitcoin is not one Bitcoin, because that's like the one Bitcoin is like the catchphrase, but really it's not, if it's one Bitcoin and a whole bunch of UTXOs. And so it'll be interesting to see if that becomes a point of disclosure in the future on how you actually manage it, what the policy around that management is, because, when fee rates do go up into the hundreds, you're talking about sizable fees involved or necessary to consolidate and to move that coin around. So that'll be, I think, an interesting thing to look at miners for, or the miners are going to need to look at.
Have you guys looked at block template construction, sort of a conversation, along with like what's happening with Ocean Pool and those sort of things like Griid?
That's a good point too, because in fact, my alt account tweeted something in advance of the halving. Especially, it was just looking like 840,000 was going to be a huge block, which of course it turned out to be a huge block. That a large, well, to be fair, I'm not sure how much they would have, the ocean mining would have actually filtered out, because the inscribe commands were the commit transactions that were happening sort of before, and they were sort of spread out in the blocks leading up to the halving block. But the actual reveal, I guess it is an inscription. So maybe they would have filtered those out. But basically, I was saying, do your quote unquote ethical beliefs about spamming Bitcoin. Do you hold on to those beliefs when there's 42 Bitcoin, or I don't remember what it was, but I think it was either 30s or 40s,
around 40
Bitcoin. Do your morals hold up at 40? Now, ultimately, we didn't get to find out because by BTC ended up mining it, and of course they had their own little. How are we going to distribute this? Or did we auctioned off the Epic Sat? Or are we actually going to distribute that to our miners, or is that that's an interesting dynamic too? But block construction will be interesting because it involves miners learning more about how blocks are constructed, because right now most mining software, like the firmware on machines, they get a whole bunch of hashes, this little tree, and then they go mine on that. They have really no idea what's sort of happening underneath the hood, what transactions are in there, and for the most part that's fine. But now, as you've seen more sort of centralization of pools, and both with Foundry, who I love, but obviously as they grow, that represents centralization risk, and then seemingly some of the other pools are actually all sort of white labeling and working together, and so there's risk there. And I think block construction becomes more important as people start to filter out things, whether or not it's ordinals, inscriptions, or runes, or whatever that looks like,
legitimate financial transactions,
or legitimate financial transactions. And really, as a Bitcoin miner who came in it from it technically and came later to sort of like I said, the economic aspect, anything that makes Bitcoin a less good money is always a concern. And I think you have to have that discussion and have to ask that question. So wrestling that with filtering. So, what if it's, you don't happen to agree with current government's policy now? Are you going to filter their transactions or censor them, if you will? So there's, things move and shift, and policies change and perceptions change. And it's, anyways, I'm just sort of rambling on at this point, but I think from a miner perspective, pulling it back there, block construction, I think, is interesting. You want to make sure you are getting the highest value that you can, because ultimately mining is maybe the most cutthroat, economically driven business out there. The protocol's designed to make you as little margin as possible. And yes, there are times when margin, goes outside based on price run that you can't control, but it literally is programmed to make as little, small margin as possible, while also realizing that it has to be economically viable to even incentivize people to, go invest millions in, electrical infrastructure and actual machines.
Which is an interesting thing, because you become levered long Bitcoin while also on very thin margins typically. So you're in like this weird spot as from a financial standpoint. I always think that Bitcoin miners are like the truest of Bitcoiners, because they're just like putting everything on the line. But with what we've seen with runes and inscriptions and all this data on chain, you can have the opposite argument where like Bitcoin miners are becoming spammers. How do you put those two things together? Where like the Bitcoin Maxi crowd is like against this, but Bitcoin miners like, we're keeping the lights on here. So like there's like definitely a conflict between the two camps.
I mean, it's interesting because you can say miners are the spammers, but at the end of the day, miners are trying to survive. And so if someone is willing to pay more for block space than someone else based on the type of transaction, then how is that different from toll road, that someone's willing to pay slightly more, or I guess infinitely more than zero, but to pay more to have, access to a different, path? I don't know. It's hard. It's definitely hard to reconcile that. But ultimately, really, the miners are sort of at the mercy of pools until, Stratum v2 and
Mhm.
and you know, block construction. But the reality is, even with Stratum v2, how many miners are actually going to be spending time, especially smaller people, home miners? They're really going to be looking at what blocks they're constructing. They're going to have the default policy is going to be order transactions by fee rate. Boom. And
Yeah.
like, is going to be that much different? You know, I guess time will tell.
Yeah. So you are anti fix the filters.
Yeah, I mean,
Where do you fall on the ocean pool stance?
well, I mean, like I said, it's to completely throw the argument out
Yeah.
and just say they're censoring Bitcoin and they're trying to implement their own policies or their own, force their own beliefs on the network. Like I said before, to anything that has the potential to make Bitcoin less good money, it's worth considering.
Mm-hmm.
That said, anytime you filter anything, lends itself into a path of filtering things that, for reasons that might not be because you think it's spam,
Yeah.
or you think it's taking up block space. It certainly would have been hard to leave, 40 Bitcoin on the table at the halving block.
A lot of money.
But again, if that's the principles you believe in, then and you stick to those principles, then I can at least respect it. I may not necessarily agree with it, but I can, that you did. Well, of course, we don't know what actually happened because they didn't mine the block. But the filters are challenging because anytime that an angle, you could argue that that's an angle of attack. If someone says inscriptions and ordinals and runes are an attack on Bitcoin, filtering you could also see as an attack on Bitcoin. What if El Salvador tomorrow they go attack the country next door? Are we going to start filtering all of their transactions because we can?
Censor them and keep all their money in their hardware wallets. They can't use it.
So
there we go.
I mean, anytime you open that path for controlling other people's behavior, it can be twisted into whatever else you want it to be.
Any other questions? I got one on OpCat when I get to.
Yeah, I don't want to end this without touching on your personal project, because again, runes, ordinals folks listening to this is one of the more interesting technical projects going on. What is Mutable Trees? How does it work?
Yeah, so Mutable Trees, it was sort of I say inspired, but as an engineer, technical person, I'm not remotely artistic, but when I was a kid, I would doodle trees like when I wasn't paying attention in class. And so like trees were about the only thing I could draw that remotely resembled what they were supposed to look like. So I've always enjoyed doodling trees. In fact, I've got notebooks from high school that I can go back and look at some of the trees. Again, and trying to highlight some of the cool things that, both in Bitcoin, because there's so many people that came to Bitcoin, in the last 12 months from ordinals bridging over from, Ethereum, NFTs, sort of that world, that don't understand Bitcoin and some of the cool things like the halving and the supply reduction and the emission schedule, or the difficulty adjustment, which is maybe one of the coolest innovations in all of Bitcoin. And so the idea behind the project was really to highlight some of those things. Now, I ultimately missed one of the important deadlines, which was the halving, because the trees were theoretically in generations going to sprout at the halvings. I missed this one because, runes ultimately ended up taking over my life, or taking over my spare time for a little while. But basically what these trees are is they start from seed, and then using the block height, they'll effectively grow as the chain grows. And so they'll all grow a little bit differently. And there's different ways to create random numbers and figure out branching patterns and branching sizes. But we're using the block hash. So as the blocks get added to the chain, there's this block hash, which is the 256-bit value that has to hit the certain underneath a certain number to meet the difficulty criteria. Well, it turns out, in fact, I posted a tweet not too long ago that was talking about the actual randomization, because theoretically, SHA-256, the bit output should be 100% evenly distributed, and it turns out it's pretty close. I think I only looked at like the last 10,000 blocks, mostly because well, I just picked 10,000. And so using that as a random number generator to, control how these trees are growing felt like the right way to do it. So again, like block hashes, difficulty adjustments. So each tree changes 63 times during a difficulty adjustment, and then it reseeds itself. The random number then changes so that a different pattern. And the reason for that was I didn't want people, because so much of these, generative art, you can just, right click and inspect code in your browser. You can then go use JavaScript debug tools, and you could go see what this is going to look like in a week, in a month, in a year. So by reseeding it at every difficulty adjustment, you could only theoretically advance it, 63 growth periods, which isn't very much. And so, trying to use some of the cool things that exist in the ordinals protocol, in the endpoints that are available for some of this generative art. So basically, the trees will sprout. Then they'll grow, and so you get to actually watch your tree grow. And there were some things I was going to try to do, like maybe mint or etch and mint a rune that was like mutable tree fertilizer, and so you could actually like change how your tree grows by depositing.
We don't have recursive runes endpoints as of the recording of this,
but we're not there yet. So that was the idea, and of course I've spent some time on the actual inscribing of that because I wanted the parent-child. Some people say some people say provenance. I always say provenance.
So
I say provenance, but and so the parent-child collection, provenance for defining a collection on chain within the ordinals protocol. I wanted to do that, of course, but I also wanted to preserve, like, as these generations of trees. There's 6 generations of trees that sprout at varying block heights, and so I did actually create some multiple parent-child. I think it just got released in 7 or 17, I think, is when that actually officially started getting
recently.
Supported. And so I built a custom inscribing tool to actually, so like the 6th generation, well, it has a parent, as a grandparent, great-grandparent, great-great, and so on. I wanted all of them to be in that lineage. But the way the protocol works, you have to submit, you just submit the parents in the same inscribe transaction. And so if you were to do that, it would have taken close to 1,000 different transactions, and it would have had to have been done in like 1,000 blocks. So I wrote a separate inscribing tool that actually packaged everything up and could do the entire collection in 6 transactions, which I thought was pretty cool. So that I got to get.
You combined like 10 different things, which I think are all really, really cool, and created a project of trees which are generative by block hash and block height, which experience a growth and death cycle by difficulty adjustment.
Yes.
Tell me how this is not the coolest thing to Bitcoin miners ever.
I don't know. It feels like it's cool, but it's also a whole bunch of nerdy stuff sort of underneath the hood.
It is
that not all people appreciate.
But you can buy one and experience.
Yeah, you can buy
if
one.
you don't.
Yeah,
Really
you can get one and experience, and if you don't like it, that's the best thing. If you don't like it, you can just
sell it
and buy a different one.
Yeah,
and then because they'll all be different. Some will be, some will have 3 main branches. Some will have 4. Some will be, some will look like crepe myrtles. Some will look like oak trees.
So speaking of nerdy stuff, Will hinted at it. It's kind of embedded into the ordinals narrative. Opcat. Or opcodes in general, but opcat specifically.
We're trying to get a survey of everyone. So we're at Bitcoin Plus this weekend, and a lot of it was Bitcoin scripting, which became covenants, which then the conversation went to cat. I think everything was just talking about cat.
Everybody's talking about cat.
And we had Peter Todd on yesterday. We talked about cat with him. He's not anti-cat, but he's like, we got better stuff. Let's wait a few years, do some other things instead. It does seem like there's some momentum. And for miners, once they are like a little more educated on some of these opcodes and covenants, and specifically cat, seems like they'll really be into it because it's like potential for lots of applications on chain, perhaps, and then more revenue. Have you looked into cat at all, or any other opcodes? And do you have any opinions on them? Then I have a follow-up after that as well.
Yeah, no. So I will admit that I have been less involved, or less involved is not the right word. I haven't followed the opcat as much. I do love Quantum Cats, the project, because there's a lot of similar concepts and ideas that they're using, um, that that I had that sort of falls into the Mutable Trees, bucket and things that we're doing. In terms of the actual script, script and the opcodes, I certainly know a whole lot more now, um, after having done this Rune stuff on some of the opcodes. But the reality is the vast majority of what I've been working on is mostly push byte opcodes. I haven't done as much with understanding like the ifs and the compares and the even just send to this address and verifying that I definitely know a whole lot less about. Uh, but I think it's always valuable to think and try to understand what new features can do to Bitcoin, and what cases they can unlock. I think there also needs to be a discussion on, are some of those features better suited at a different layer, on top of Bitcoin. And I don't necessarily have an opinion on Opcat. At this point, I'm just not knowledgeable enough in that. But
do you think other miners are? Do you think your view is kind of representative of other miners?
I would expect, and as I'm just guessing, that if you asked 100 miners, they would probably 90 or more wouldn't have any idea what you're talking about. I mean, I know if I can say for me, I knew very, very little about Bitcoin scripting and the opcodes, unless you have, unless you've started to write your own inscribing tool and or write your own Rune etcher, minter, and airdropper. The reality is, I think most miners just haven't gotten there. Maybe either they're not interested, which is possible, or it's too complicated, which is also possible, because it's not simple, or it's just not necessary. And it's okay for people to enjoy Bitcoin at whatever whatever area they're in. So that's my guess, is that 90+% would probably have no idea what Opcat is, or even that Opcat is a thing.
With speedy trial and the way that like Bitcoin upgrades, you need pools to flag and all that.
Yep.
I'm wondering how it's going to be different this time, because people don't like speedy trial and they want to try it differently. We need to get more miners involved. I feel like there is more overlap between miners and developers now, since a lot of the miners have moved over to the Western Hemisphere.
Yep.
Like, do you think that changes with the next soft fork? Do you think there's going to be more conversation between the two camps, or are miners just kind of helpless, don't care about?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think the miners have got to do a better job of getting more involved in those decisions, because ultimately, if we look at SegWit, that upgrade was really decided by, let's call it at the time, 10, 12, 15 pools. So, and at the end of the day, it's, there's someone in each of those that's probably making the ultimate decision. So basically 15 or less people made the miners' decisions for them.
Yeah.
Because there's no way for a miner with, Stratum V1 to indicate which way you're going to, which way you're voting with your hash rate. You're voting your hash rate based on what pool you are mining to. But if your pool is doing something you don't agree with, well, yes, while the theoretical switching cost of changing pools is low, it's not actually that low, because either if you're a public miner, you've got audits, you got compliance issues, and if you're not, it's still like you've got wallets set up, you've got things operate the same way, and to just change to a different pool is not exactly zero cost. It is zero cost, but it's not zero time cost and effort. So I think that is definitely an area where miners need to get more involved with the pools that they're mining to, and working with, and talking through those things. Because anytime you change something like Bitcoin with, what's the uptime, 99.9999 whatever percent, if that were to create problems, the amount of wealth destruction that could happen by unintended consequences is certainly challenging. Now, there's lots of people that are looking at these things, and I think, in general, most people feel comfortable with the slowness, the lack of speed at changes. And I think that's a good thing. But yeah, I think miners definitely need to get more involved. The actual people running the machines and understanding what these changes are, what the byproducts could be. because they certainly have as much, if not more, capital invested than anyone in the Bitcoin space in infrastructure, machines, software, time, people, money. So yeah, I think it's important for people to start thinking about what those things, the impact they can have, and whether or not that's what they're voting for.
Mm-hmm. Anything else?
I don't have any other questions. I mean,
We've grilled you for an hour.
yeah, we've grilled you. We've covered
a lot of territory.
I don't know. I feel like we're entering into a new era where the average Bitcoin miner, we just talked about this, I mean, has to not only know how to plug in machines, how to troubleshoot control boards, in your case, how to actually work on ASIC chips themselves. But now you have to talk about Bitcoin scripting and Bitcoin at a very high concept and deep technical level. Are we entering into a new era of Bitcoin miner renaissance man here?
I hope so.
I see him here before me.
Yeah, I'm not sure Renaissance man, maybe more like Rain Man. Yeah, no, I think there's a lot of changes, especially as margins get tighter and subsidy goes down. Yeah, there's a lot of meat on the bone, and miners that can understand the bigger ecosystem and be able to navigate that, I think, are going to be the ones that have the most success in this next epoch.
Love it. Mike, thanks for joining the Mining Pod /Bitcoin Season 2 Ask Shop. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.